Okay, folks, tonight we're going to talk about the cerebrum. Now, when you are addressing the cerebrum, you have to keep in mind they are separated into hemispheres, right and left. The cerebrum also makes up a good chunk of your total brain mass. Now, topographically, when you are observing some of the features of the cerebrum, you'll see these convolutions. Now, if they're elevated, you call them gyri. And if they are grooves, you call them sulci. They go hand in hand. You may recall in the cerebellum, you did see elevations. I did address those, but they call them folia, and they're more straight in appearance. Fissures are simply described as deeper versions of these sulci. They're just deeper grooves. You have a longitudinal one and a transverse fissure. Now the longitudinal, as you can see in figures 7.6 and 7.7, this longitudinal fissure is what separates the right and left, sorry, wrong side, right and left cerebral hemispheres. And the sagittal view of the brain shows you here. This depicts the location of the transverse fissure. This fissure separates the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum that's not pictured in this image here. You can also see the convoluted. Let me draw a line here showing you, I'm highlighting the convoluted elevations, the so-called gyri. And then you also have the convoluted grooves called the sulci. Now, the cerebrum is separated into lobes. This coincides with the cranial bones. So, for example, you have your frontal lobe, you have your temporal lobe, you have your parietal lobe, you have your occipital lobe. Now, the insula, you can't see it here from this image. You would have to push down on the temporal lobe, pull up on the frontal/parietal lobe, and you'll be able to find it and see the insula that's deep to all of this. In this picture, figure 7.9, you can see that we've cut away a good amount of the frontal parietal lobe and part of the temporal lobe to find the underlying insula. Okay, let's take a look at the cortex, motor and sensory areas. For starters, there is a sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And here's the picture that I provided you. Here's your frontal lobe. Here's your parietal lobe over here. This parietal lobe here. And here's your frontal lobe over here. Right? Now notice how there's a central sulcus here that separates the two major parts, the two lobes, frontal and parietal. So, anterior to that central sulcus, you'll find a precentral gyrus, and posterior to that central sulcus, you'll find a postcentral gyrus. And each one has a specific component or function. This is the primary motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, and this is the area for the primary sensory cortex. Keep in mind you have here in the precentral gyrus, that's your primary motor cortex, you'll find a good number of these pyramidal cells. And remember, you may recollect when I was addressing in the previous discussion in the spinal cord, we talked about some tracts that occur in the central nervous system, and we were addressing, for example, cortical spinal tracts, as the name implies, from the cortex to the spine. It's obviously for motor information, and the pyramidal cells are the primary neurons that are located, or they are the primary neurons of the so-called cortical spinal tract, and they are aggregated in the area of the precentral gyrus. You also have a occipital lobe, and this is the area of your visual cortex. Your temporal lobe is your area for auditory and olfactory cortex, and you have your insula and portions of the frontal lobe for your sense of taste. Here's a color coding image showing you some of the functional components of the brain. Now, you have important parts of the brain here. For example, you have what's called Broca's area. They also call it the motor speech area, which is right about here. Okay, and that part is important in coordinating your pattern of speech with regards to coordinating your tongue, your throat, and your lips when a person speaks. And keep in mind that part is mainly emphasized or occurs in the left hemisphere only when you're addressing Broca's area. Your visual cortex, that pretty much right about here, this area back here, occipital lobe area, then that pretty much receives information from your second cranial nerve. You also have what's known as Wernicke's area, right about here. And that part is, its main purpose is for your comprehension of speech and writing information, or I should say speech and written information. And you can see here in this picture they're pulling down on parts of the temporal lobe, pulling up, or they're retracting the frontal lobe to find the insula, or they also call this the Isle of Rio. Okay, and again, some more topographical anatomy. Again, you're able to appreciate here the longitudinal fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres. And here you can observe the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and back here you can observe the occipital lobe. This is showing you the histology of the cortex of the cerebrum. Going from most superior to deepest, you have the molecular layer. You have all this granulations going on here, layers 2 through 6. And it is here where you have these large pyramidal cells, or these so-called cells, or they call them Betz cells. And you can close up here to show you what these neurons look like. They're pyramidal in shape. Now, we're going to go deeper to the deep to the cortex and get to the core of the cerebral hemispheres, and we're going to take a look at the what's known as the cerebral or basal nuclei. Some textbooks out there address this as the basal ganglia. Those terms are used interchangeably, basal nuclei, basal ganglia, but the most correct, obviously, is the basal nuclei, but basal ganglia, you know that you're alluding to the structures that are depicted here on this slide. This is the nucleus. You'll find a component of the cerebral nuclei is the amygdaloid nucleus. This is a component of your limbic system. You have the corpus striatum that includes the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. Now, these parts are involved in your subconscious adjustment and modification of voluntary motor commands. So here's a picture showing you a good amount of the cerebral hemisphere cut out, removed, to show the underlying basal nuclei. And here are some of the parts. For example, here's the caudate nucleus right over here. Should say here's the head of it right here. And as it goes up, you have a body. You have a tail, and notice how it culminates or ends with the amygdala. Then you have your lentiform nucleus here. It's located laterally here. Not much to add to that. Now, your limbic system includes your hippocampus. Now, this is involved in learning and long-term memory. Your amygdala allows you to interpret fear. Your cingulate gyrus is just simply a gyrus that's right above the corpus callosum. You can't see in this picture, but I'll show you a picture of that. There you go. This picture here shows you the corpus callosum, and right above it is the so-called cingulate gyrus. As the name implies, one gyrus. And then you also have your fornix. So all these are the components of the so-called limbic system in the brain, in the cerebrum. I forgot to mention something important, folks. The frontal lobe is the part of your brain that has your, right over here, frontal lobe. You have what's called a prefrontal cortex, and that part is responsible or mainly involved in determining your personality, in case you didn't know that. Now, the thalamus makes up about 80% of that, the vesicles. Remember this term? I addressed this in the development of how the brain is organized, the so-called diencephalon. It's two bilateral masses that are adhered to each other by what's called the intermediate mass, or what's known as the interthalamic adhesion. What this does, it allows communication between the two thalami. And then you have some nuclei located in the anterior part of the thalamus, which is called a hypothalamus, or they're actually aggregated in the area called a hypothalamus. And then you have what's called the pulvinar. This is the posterior part, posterior region of the thalamus. And then you also have in here your dorsal and posterior nuclei. And here are the functions of all these parts here. They project visual and auditory information to your visual and auditory cortices. They also mediate sensation and motor activities. Pretty much the thalamus is considered the gateway to consciousness overall. Gateway to consciousness. Here's a picture showing you this is pointing out, or what's highlighted here is the brainstem. Here's your cerebrum right over here, cerebellum over here. So if you remove the cerebrum, and then you'll find the diencephalon, or what's known as the thalamus here. And here is the area of the so-called pulvinar. Now, in the hypothalamus, you'll find some structures here, the mammillary bodies. These parts are connected to the so-called columns of the fornix. Okay, and in the hypothalamus, you'll also find this so-called infundibulum. It's a little stalk that pretty much suspends the hypophyseal gland. Pretty term for what is known as your pituitary. Here are the functions of the hypothalamus. Controls autonomic function, sets appetite and thirst drive, your homeostasis, emotional response, and your sleep and wake cycles. So, looking at the area of the hypothalamus here, okay, and here's the so-called infundibulum, little stalk. Here's the fornix. Now in this cut you can't really see it, but I'll just draw it in here. The fornix has what's called the so-called columns that allow or connect to the so-called mammillary glands, mammillary bodies I should say, mammillary bodies here. And the function of that mammillary bodies, folks, is for what's known as your recollective memory. So it's part of the hippocampal formation. So you have your mammillary body, your columns of your fornix. There's the body of the fornix, and it goes back, forms what's called a crus towards the posterior, and then it continues and forms the hippocampus. There we go here. Here's a part of your hippocampus right there. And here's your posterior column or crus of your fornix. Now, another important structure here in this picture that's very obvious, it's an area of white fibers. This is your corpus callosum. Major important structure that connects the two sides of these cerebral hemispheres. Corpus callosum this part here is known as the genu, anterior part of the corpus callosum, and this part back here is known as the splenium of the corpus callosum. All corpus callosum, but you have a genu, anterior part, posterior, splenium. Let me write that out here. Splenium. And here's your little adhesion that connects both sides of the thalamus. Now, here's a coronal section of the brain at about this level here. You can see this is all the cortex of the brain right here, the gray matter, the deeper white matter here. And then here's some of the components of the cerebral nuclei. Here's your so-called caudate nucleus right about here. And here's your putamen and your globus pallidus. Collectively, this is known as the lentiform nucleus. It's shaped as the shape of a lens, hence the term lentiform nucleus. And then that's about it. And then you have another part, your amygdala, down in that area. You can also see the thalamus in close proximity to the caudate nucleus. Okay, now the hypothalamus has an association with the pituitary glands. The hypothalamus is considered like the CEO of the endocrine system, and pretty much the pituitary gland is the organ that is the manager of the hormone, so to speak. Now, the hypothalamus does have a good number of nuclei. You all recall what nuclei are. Nuclei are aggregates of nerve cell bodies in the CNS. Now, there are two parts to the pituitary gland. You have a glandular part, this is anterior, and the neural part, which is posterior. This part, in terms of embryology, it is derived from the what's known as the Rathke's pouch, which is a derivative of one of your germ layers, primary layers known as the ectoderm. Neural portion obviously is derived from neural tissue. Okay, this is derived from neural tissue, or this is the posterior part of the pituitary. Now, here are the basic functions of the hypothalamus. Regulates anterior posterior output via releasing and inhibiting hormones. So you have RH and IH, and you have some nuclei in the hypothalamus that produce these hormones that are going to be temporarily stored in the posterior pituitary and then to eventually be released. Or I should say, releasing and inhibitory hormones are involved in the secretion of hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary. Then you have a couple of hormones, two hormones to be specific. You have your ADH, that stands for antidiuretic hormone, or they also call this vasopressin. Okay, that's one of the hormones. The other one is oxytocin. So these are the hormones that are produced in the nuclei in the hypothalamus that are going to be transported straight directly into the posterior pituitary for storage purposes, temporary storage, and then eventually released. So you have releasing and inhibitory hormones that are involved or these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and then they are responsible for the releasing or inhibiting of hormones that are secreted and produced from the anterior pituitary, or the glandular portion of the pituitary gland. So here's a picture that illustrates this best. So here you have a couple of nuclei, your supraoptic nucleus and your paraventricular. So these nuclei are, as you can see, they have rather large nerve cell bodies, large pericardia, and these are responsible for their hormonal substances to be transported through these axons here. There are these two nuclei, sets of them. Transport their substances through these long axons, and notice how they all travel and they terminate here in the posterior part of the pituitary gland. These little terminals are called herring bodies, and they're best viewed microscopically. So these are the two major nuclei that are involved in the production of ADH and for the oxytocin. Again, to be eventually just stored here in the posterior pituitary for eventual release. Now, this other nucleus here, amongst others, just one of them, I'll just address one of them for now. The arcuate nucleus. This is responsible for the production of the RH and inhibiting hormones. As you can see, these axons are going to transport their substances here in this area, this little portal system here. It's a system of blood vessels or capillaries that carry their hormones, in this case releasing or inhibiting, and carry it in the direction of the anterior or glandular portion of the pituitary, and to signal release of the hormones that are produced or synthesized here in this part of the pituitary gland and out through this blood vessel here. Also notice how the pituitary gland is supplied by a so-called superior hypophyseal artery. This blood vessel is a branch. It's a branch of the fourth part, or the cerebral part of your IC. IC stands for internal carotid. You may recall in my discussion in the skull session, I addressed the carotid canal and how the internal carotid goes into there. You have a cervical part, then you have a part that turns, the petrous part, part 2. Part 3 is the cavernous part going up. Part 4 is the cerebral part that gives off branches of several blood vessels. I'll address more of those when I get to the discussion on the intracranial blood flow, but the superior hypophyseal artery is a branch of that fourth part of the internal carotid artery. It supplies blood to the pituitary gland. Then you have here your so-called infundibulum, the stalk. That's what suspends the pituitary gland. Okay, here's again, overview of the two parts of the pituitary. Here's the glandular portion, anterior. Here's your neural portion, the part that's derived from the neural tissue, or the neural part of the pituitary gland. It's mainly a storage site for those two hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. Now, here's a quick review of the pituitary and its hormones. So you have ADH. Its target sites are the kidney tubules, and its purpose is to reabsorb and conserve water. ADH is released in response to high solute concentrations in your blood. Its purpose is to induce you is during times of water shortage, or if you are dehydrated, so to speak, then this kicks in to allow you to conserve water. Now, if you have hyposecretion of that ADH, then the end result will be a condition known as diabetes insipidus. Growth hormone, major hormone from the anterior pituitary. Remember, this is from the posterior pituitary. This hormone, along with oxytocin. Oxytocin is the other hormone secreted, or released, I should say, not secreted, released from the posterior pituitary. Okay, then you have your anterior pituitary or glandular portion. This secretes growth hormone. Sometimes tumors can grow in the area of the cavernous sinus and cause a problem where you have hypersecretion of GH. If you have too much secretion of growth hormone in a growing child, you call it gigantism. If you have hypersecretion of growth hormone in an adult, you call it acromegaly. Now, if you have too little secretion of growth hormone, that will culminate in what's known as dwarfism. You have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, another hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary. What will elicit its release is the hormone that is produced in the hypothalamus, thyroid releasing hormone. Remember, you have hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, and they will exert their effects on the anterior pituitary, and these are the releasing or inhibiting hormones. ACTH, okay, and this is signaled by what's known as CRH or releasing hormone, and again, this is from your hypothalamus. You also have your epithalamus. This is this area right here. Okay, what do you find in the epithalamus? You find your pineal gland or pineal body right about here, and so forth. Here and here. Now, this hormone for this gland is responsible for secreting melatonin. This is involved in your sleep cycle. If you're a lower vertebrate, this gland is considered your third eye. If you are a lower vertebrate, third eye, it's involved in the circadian rhythms, right? Also, we have a tendency, all of us, as you age, you'll develop what's known as corpora arenacea. That's a fancy term that describes what's known as brain sand that you can see under light microscopy when you're looking at a pineal gland. And it's not really known what the purpose of that is. But keep in mind, you probably heard of the song, Somebody Bring Me a Dream, Mr. Sandman. Whoever was singing that song was probably was probably a neuroscience student maybe, I don't know. But probably before my time. But point is that they're addressing Mr. Sandman bringing you a dream, and they're more than likely describing the so-called corpora arenacea that's located within the so-called pineal gland, which is right back here. Now, here is an image showing you an abnormal growth here. It's an abnormal growth, and then when they perform the surgery on the patient, it looks like a tooth. And what this is pretty much a tumor. It is known as a craniopharyngioma. What happened here is that this is an abnormal growth of tissue. You can develop hair, teeth-like tissue growing in that part of the brain, and this is actually an abnormal growth of the it's an abnormal growth derived from Rathke's pouch. So, as you can see in this case here, you have a 4-month-old male infant presented with increasing head circumference on routine pediatric visits. When they did the MRI, they found a suprasellar mass. Suprasellar, obviously that mass was located above the sella turcica. That's that little area within the sphenoid bone where you have the pituitary gland sitting on there. The information here, multiple structures along the right periphery of the mass showed characteristics similar to those of teeth in the mandible. So as you saw, you have teeth-like structures here that group within the brain, and the patient underwent tumor resection through a right pterional approach. They approached that, they got to that mass through the right pterion. You guys know what this is. That's that fragile part of the anterolateral aspect of the skull. And you saw there were fully formed teeth in that picture. The tumors consisted of organized stratified squamous epithelium and wet keratin. Not much to add to that. So this, histologically, this craniopharyngioma resemble odontogenic tumors and cysts. Now, obviously, when they remove the tumor, the person is making good developmental progress, and so forth. So, a person that embarks on the profession of being a neurosurgeon can definitely take care of these problems in these patients. Also, keep in mind that from a developmental standpoint, sometimes if a patient does not develop, or a newborn, it's usually fatal. But if a newborn does not develop the cerebral hemispheres, that condition is known as anencephaly. Anencephaly, that's a condition that describes a newborn or an infant that did not develop a brain. Anencephaly. Now, this picture is an MRI or CT scan. It's the purpose here. This exercise is to allow you to try to figure out what you're looking at, what cut. So let's do a little quiz here. If you're looking at this here, always remember when you're looking at a image, especially if it's axial view, axial cut, right? Always remember that the imaging is from caudal to rostral. Caudal to rostral, and this allows you to determine sides, what's right or what's left. So you have caudal to rostral here. And so the premise here is to allow you to determine where the cut is. So is the cut here through A? Is the cut through B? Is the cut through C? Is the cut through D? There was a cut through E. It's definitely not E, because that's a coronal cut. It's definitely not A, it's too high. B, still too high. C, we're getting a little close. But D looks more so like it. And how do you determine that? You can see part of here is here, part of this part of the pons right about here, and you can definitely map it out here. The big giveaway is the parts of the temporal lobe where they are being demonstrated there. And folks, that concludes my discussion on the cerebrum, and I will continue this with a video on the